the Redbird Reboot podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans. Welcome into the Redbird Reboot podcast. Got your host and co-host, or your co-host and host. We've got Blake Murphy here at Blake Murphy 7 and at Pancakes, so Marcos Labrada. We've been off for a couple of weeks. There's been a lot going on, at least, whether it's with personal lives, and some of it is just being able to take some time off after the Eagles have won the Super Bowl. Marcos, as we check in tonight, we've got a bunch of news that we're going to try to cover. We have the NFLPA report cards, in which the Cardinals maybe have taken a step back. We have some combine news and reviews that will probably do a little bit of some of the chatter that's being out there. And then, of course, last podcast, we went over the offensive free agents. We're going to talk about the defensive free agents, and the Cardinals have a lot of cap space to work with. As we get started tonight, Marcos, how are you doing, and how's the general feeling, at least you think, with Cardinals Nation heading into, as we say, another important NFL offseason?
Well, as we know, for the second year in a row, I believe we're the worst team in the NFL when it comes to that report card. It's very important, and I really like the fact that they do the NFLPA report cards across every team. I believe the Vikings were the best last year. And so to see that there wasn't that much improvement in certain categories, like one with the ownership, the other one with the weight room, it went from an F to a D, I believe. So I guess you could say that's an improvement. Locker rooms are still bad. And you hear this time and time again. You hear, the casitas, they're being, Mike Bidwell's prioritizing the casitas, and when he should be prioritizing other sections of the team. And I do agree with certain aspects of that playing a role in free agency, because we're going to be busy this year, and that's what we are getting news of, that it's going to be a busy free agency. They look at that. So don't really, I think the fan base is kind of feeling like apathy towards the fact that, like, we haven't even improved.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, at least with how the Cardinals have been perceived nationally, has been a team that has struggled with spending, of being able to have this perception that has stuck with the team ever since Bill Bidwell came to Arizona, essentially. Let's go ahead here and just jump right in and talk a little bit about this year's report card by taking a look at last year's report card. So Cardinals finished last year 27th in the NFL. They ended up having a couple of key categories for the most part. Like, one of the biggest underlying issues they had were more of an office building than a premier athletic facility. Belief in the willingness to invest in the facilities remained low. And one of the things I know we've talked about, at least, is that there were some places that there were upgrades from last season. There was a daycare and a small family room, and then they stopped the charging of players for dinner. You take a look at last year, the Cardinals at least were able to go a bit higher in terms of treatment for families. They went from, I believe, a D the first year to a D+. Food and cafeteria was ranked low. Nutritionist, dietitian, while given a C, it was ranked low. Usually this is someone from outside the organization. So this is something we'll talk about as it is with this year. The locker room, of course, was 31st in the National Football League. 32nd was actually last year the Kansas City Chiefs, who just come off of a Super Bowl victory. The owner, Clark Hunt, actually did make some renovations into there. The training room, training staff at least, was well regarded. The weight room was a C- strength coaches. And the team travel actually increased some when it came up to it, with everything about the people making a big deal about the team playing. We saw last year that Michael Bidwell said they were going to take a lot of people out of the Cardinals building. So that way it was take a lot of the marketing, the behind the scenes, the season ticket package people, anything that goes around with branding. Those people were taken out, moved into a different building. So the Cardinals were at least able to have a bit more space. The biggest thing, at least, of course, when we talk about these ratings, are you take the survey And the survey will usually show a couple of things. One is you put all the surveys together and you're able to just look at your ranking. Like if you are ranked 32nd and your weight room is the worst weight room, it may not be the worst weight room of all time. But according to NFL standards and the expectations, it would be. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, at least for all of that, is when you do craft these sort of reviews, you're sending a message for one way or another. So a good example is Kansas City Chiefs. Their weight room was authentically an F, or the locker room authentically an F. You wonder, how could they go off and win a Super Bowl? The answer is this report card has been a great way for players to be able to let ownership groups know how they really feel and essentially push them through public shaming to make some changes. With that, let's take a look at with the Cardinals this season. And it's not that much better overall, Marcos. The treatment of families was around 29th. The food and dining area went down to a D minus, still pretty low ranked. Their dietitian and nutritionist went up a little bit to a B. The locker room was given an F minus. You can wonder, how did the locker room go from last year being an F to an F minus at 31st? The answer is nothing changed about the locker room, but the Chiefs improved theirs. The training room was at a D minus. Training staff actually was a little bit different as far as being a C rank. The weight room was given an F. Now, when it comes to what are the positives to look at, the biggest one, at least, is the Arizona Cardinals. They received a group for their head coach. So Jonathan Gannon, that's top 10. Like they're like, we have a top 10 beloved head coach. Other teams that we've seen in the past that have had thriving head coaches, a good example being the New England Patriots, with having Bill Belichick there, went from an A to a C plus C minus with Gerard Mayo. He was let go after a year. And the ownership, at least for the Arizona Cardinals, hey, Michael Bidwill, you went up from an F to a D minus, but you still did not change your placement whatsoever. Part of the reason why is you take a look at what a new ownership group in Washington would do. And Josh Harris came in, moved the Commanders up from being one of the lowest ranked in terms of ownership up to one of the highest ranked. Thus, the Cardinals, instead of actually taking a step forward from some of those places, they kind of stayed right where they were. And Marcos, that was good enough for not first, not second, not 31st, but that was good for 32nd out of 32 teams when looked at in total, which I think pretty much everyone can say. If there's 32 teams and you finish 32nd of them, there's no guarantee you wouldn't have finished, 33rd out of 32. It's not necessarily possible, but it is an embarrassment. And I think it does say a lot about the Cardinals. Third year in a row, there has been a push on Michael Bidwill, and third year in a row, we have not seen them be able to really move that report card up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just it's exactly what you said. It's public shaming. So we're gonna look at this, and before I even knew about any of this stuff, like the report card having to do with the locker rooms and stuff, I heard one person speak out on it, and I guess he got trashed by like a big Twitter, like somebody who was big in like the Twitter space for the Cardinals, and it was Pat McAfee. He was watching the
Right. AQ Shipley is the one I believe you're talking about.
yeah,
That he was on the Pat McAfee show.
yeah, and it was like halfway through. There was that special that we had halfway through the 2022 season, Hard Knocks and stuff. People were complaining, and well, yeah, they were complaining about the fact that like the locker rooms looked like crap and the facilities looked like crap, and I was like thinking to myself, I've never seen what a general like building is supposed to look like because I'm not paying attention to other teams like behind the scenes stuff. But I got used to thinking to myself, well, that's how a facility should look, and then this brings on to light because you have players that come from other teams and they join the Cardinals and they're gonna say, yeah, this facility is like crap. Like that's the reason why it gets such a low rating. And then that's when I got to knowing that. So it really helps me and other people like know and put pressure on the owner to say, hey, really, like, why are we ranked 32? Why are we like one of the worst like teams for players and whatnot? I get that players can pay for food because they're millionaires, but in a competitive type of situation, if other teams are choosing not to charge their players, maybe you should go down that route because I know, yeah, they're millionaires. They don't need any more money, but you're an investor and you invested in them. You're the owner. So they're part of your investment. It kind of behooves you to take care of them.
Yeah, no, one of the things I think that really stands out is that we have seen some improvement that the Cardinals have made in places, but at the end of the day, there's so much to be desired when it comes down to it. That, like you said, there's a realistic aspect, which is if you're talking about the Walmart money, that's the Walton family as who owns the Broncos. You talk about Josh Harris, who's buying the Commanders outright. So it'd be a different level of money than a family-owned legacy owner in Michael Bidwell. But at the same time, you can take a look at least here at a good screenshot for those of you watching on our online video of the Cardinals locker room. You've got plastic folding chairs set at each one. You've got at least, the lights that are being able to be shown. It's pretty cramped. You can see at least obviously that in the corner there, got two chairs having to face the lockers that are pretty much stacked right next to each other, not as much room. A lot of the players are not going to be coming out of college like this. For a good example, Cardinals have drafted a couple of players out of the Ohio State University, Paris Johnson and Marvin Harrison Jr. This is like what their locker room would look like after some of the upgrades. They've got a family football suite that they have where family members can come in. They've got a lot more space, at least. The lighting you can see as far as the setup is nice and snazzy. The other thing, at least, about some of that as well is each of the players actually have a kind of cool little setup where they've got a little remote that they can move the seat in and out so they can actually sit back, relax for a little bit for the most part, have a nice little backlit system there. Being able to then have the jerseys up above in their locker. It may not necessarily be saying that you need to have this be like, a massage chair or a sauna or something like that. But it is a standard, at least, that college players now with NIL money and with the investments are expecting a lot of big things, at least here from NFL locker rooms. And when you take a look at the college players in a Division two school, this is a post, I believe, from Reddit that popped up. Someone showed this is what a Division two locker room would look like. So you're talking about no folding chairs, got plenty of spots that's there. Things are a bit more branded. And it just overall is a little bit more of a nice design. There's things aren't just one single wall. And a lot of that comes down to the space in the Cardinals facility and the space of their home locker room within the arena. It's just not something that is quite at where NFL standards are. You mentioned the AQ Shipley interview. He talked about how the Cardinals' main meeting room is also like their press room. So people will come in for press conferences, and it's just one of the areas of the space is something that could use a bit more investment. So one thing at least that you can say is part of the advantage of having an NFLPA thing like this is you actually are going to be able to see some upgrades happening within the next few years. So the Arizona Cardinals, at least, were ranked lowest, but they are reportedly, according to Michael Bidwell, set to invest about $100 million into a brand new practice facility. So the old practice facility, which is for those of you who've been out there in the west side, haven't seen it on the east side. It's kind of a small area near a local park. They have a office space that's set up, a place for the players. They got a field and a practice bubble. But it's not necessarily one of those things that's going to say state of the art. They added upgrades to what the practice facility was. This is essentially going to be we're starting from scratch, putting in a brand new one, investing $100 million. Now, some people have said that this is a kind of being shamed approach where the Cardinals shouldn't have to be. Others say, hey, this is part of what's good about the NFLPA. We need to have more public transparency to be able to allow owners to make some of these changes for players. I think at the end of the day, Marcos, it's kind of an end. Does the end justify the means of shaming in public to get the owner to do something, or should the owner do it anyway? Either way, we can expect the Cardinals to be getting a new facility and new judgments, at least, on that once they're able to roll it out within a couple of years. It's not going to be out anytime soon. It's going to be in a targeted completion date of 2027, which means you're going to be talking about 2025 season, the 2026 season, and hopefully it'll be done before the 2027 season. So at least one more year's worth of this NFLPA. And I think that that's something that's very interesting to me is that, Michael Bidwell, there's been investments made, there's been things that have popped up, but a lot of fans ultimately have, like you said, looked at these small upgrades within the plane, looked at, like you mentioned, the casitas that they're building and taking out some seating. People wondered, why does it seem like the Cardinals have just kind of had to be pushed into making some of these necessary upgrades. And I think that honestly is probably a good question at this point.
Yeah, and I mean the results they're definitely, they're coming in, the results of the report card and the shaming and whatnot. Yes, the owner should just been on top of it to begin with. I highly doubt that Michael Bidwell didn't know what other facilities look like. I highly doubt that. It's not like me, who I'm ignorant about the fact that, like, oh, our facility looks like that. Okay, well, that's what an NFL facility looks like. The locker room being that wide open and whatnot. I thought, oh, that's just a normal football locker room. But then you show me these pictures of all these other ones, and I think to myself, wow, you have college teams that have better locker rooms than the Cardinals does. We got that big logo, and that's about it. And you have everybody just spaced out. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Now, when you look at it in comparison, I believe the only time I've ever seen a really good locker room was with Alabama, but I just
Mm.
didn't think twice about like comparing both the Cardinals and the Alabama, like, facility being how it is and whatnot. So, hey, it's getting the results. I can't argue with that. $100 million is being invested. Good. At least he's taking the right approach, but it did take like some shaming to be able to do that. And of course, you can't point the finger at what players are saying this, because it's just all across the board. Everybody's saying that, like, facility suck, locker room sucks. Like, Michael, like, get on this. We need some new facilities if you want us to like have a better culture.
Yeah, and it's something where, like you said, the issue is not necessarily even that, but more of you rank 32, which means that you're sending a message saying you are clearly behind everyone else in this. We're pushing you to be able to make these upgrades. I know some people have mentioned also something that, as far as it goes with the amount of money spent, is it up to code? Is it going to be like up to snuff? Even compared to some other arenas, the Denver Broncos at least have started already working on a new $175 million training facility in Englewood to open up in June 2026. And I think that is something that you can talk about that says, hey, if Broncos are spending this much, Cardinals are spending this much, like what kind of gives? Is it something where they're still being cheap? And I think that there's probably two ways to look at this, Marcos. The first one, at least, is we have seen that, just natural for where it is with Michael Bidwell, he has been a step up from where his father has been as far as investing in the community, investing in the team, paying a lot of the different players when a lot of times there had been issues with Bill Bidwell and past times. We've mentioned on this podcast there would be legends of Bill Bidwell basically charging a player for a sock if it got a hole in it, or drafting a top star player only to see them, as soon as they're ready for that big contract, go to a different team because the Cardinals were not going to pay them to be able to stay around. They just did not have that same dedication to winning. I think that's one of the areas that we can always talk about. This is something, at least, that I've felt is you're not going to probably have something that comes up where the Cardinals are going to have an F report card that then will have nothing done. It will stay that way. Michael, at least, is dedicated to improving and winning. That is one of the things that we have seen, like when it came time to pay Kyler Murray, they paid Kyler Murray. They've been able to extend guys when it came time to move on from Steve Keim. One of the things that we can say, at least, is nice thing about Michael Bidwell is, compared to some other NFL owners, we've seen that he's at least able to take some of those steps forward and make change, because he does care that much, at least, about being able to have a decent product. Now, like we can say on the other side, of course, is when you're ranked 32 out of 32 and you're having to announce, hey, we've got this new $100 million facility that's coming up in the next few years. After the report card comes out, we can at least rectify that by saying, this is just how it kind of is with the Cardinals. It's not that you're going to have one of the best ownerships, one of the best groups of ownership, at least in the league, but you're not going to be in a spot where you're going to basically just say that, hey, this guy is not going to commit. He's not going to make any changes. Like, you got to get him out of here before you get a brand new facility. And I think that's a tough space to be able to live, Marcos, because it'd be really easy to just put that in all or nothing and say, hey, Michael just needs to sell, move the team, etc., fixing all the problems. Or it'd be super easy to be able to just say, hey, you know what, like, they'll always be terrible. Things will never be right. I think we have to be able to rectify all of that together and just be able to say that what fans should really ultimately want is for the team that they support to feel good about. When things are bad, you want to be able to not just push it off. You got to kind of embrace the suck, as it were, but then don't just stay put there. And I think that's something that we've seen, at least over the last couple of years with the team, is that Michael is making some of these upgrades slowly but surely. And the second thing I think we've talked about already is in terms of cash flow and money, Michael's not one of the richest, wealthiest owners in the National Football League. There's not nearly the Jerry Jones money. We've talked already about the Waltons, obviously. Even moving to Los Angeles with Stan Kroenke in that whole beautiful LA arena. The Cardinals really did need a lot of money, and they, I believe, approval of the Glendale City Council to be able to actually establish the arena to be created. And they've had a new influx of cash that's kind of kept them from being that team that was at State Farm Stadium outdoors back in 1988. I think the question I think a lot of fans are looking for, Marcos, is this going to be this new start for the Cardinals and kind of becoming one of those franchises? Or is this kind of two steps forward, one step back sort of a thing that we may continue and so far at least have kind of continued to see with this franchise?
Yeah, it's just just with that two steps forward, one step. I mean, two steps forward, one step back. Like the gradual up, like the upgrades and whatnot. I mean, we're at 32nd, and it sucks because this NFLPA report card came out 2 years ago, and we're last. And let's keep in mind, about a couple of years ago, I believe the owners called Dan Snyder of the Washington Commanders, which they were formerly the Washington football team, and then before that, they were something else. He was constantly being touted as the worst owner in the NFL, and look what the Commanders have gone since then. Look how much the
Went to
culture
the
has
NFC
changed.
Championship game, had high rankings, finished 16th instead of 32nd. Yeah.
I just don't want to be in a position where I'm constantly having to not only defend my owner because he's the owner of my team and whatnot. So it really sucks seeing that report card and then possibly being touted as, hey, he's probably now the new Dan Snyder. He's probably the new guy that we can just bomb on as being the worst owner, because it's not just that, it's the reports of like the culture inside the building and how he treats certain employees and what goes on in that facility. So it's not just the owner, and plus the owner does get graded, and the owner didn't grade well at all. So it sucks to be in that position where if there's enough like spotlight on him, it's going to be just like how it was with other owners that have been like so horrible for their team that like other fan bases are saying, man, I wish they could just fire that guy, or wish that guy could, I mean, not fire that guy. I wish that guy can sell the
Mm-hmm.
team, and
Yeah.
we're praying for you. And you have all these other like fan bases just kind of stepping in and be like, yeah, he needs to, like we talked about, um, the whole entire NFL has talked about like, hey, Dan Snyder needs to sell the team because we cared so much about it, even though it's not our team. We just knew how bad the culture was. So it's going to be possibly for the next couple of years, if nothing improves, it's going to be probably Michael Bidwell being under those crosshairs of the entire NFL. We're just lucky that we're not that big of a team. We're not a big market team for people to pay attention, but it's going to get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for some other comments, at least from some of our watchers, at least on YouTube, at least we got Aaron Van Buren talking about all things weight room. Shout out at least and saying that yes, it is ages behind in the weight room. Just a kind of a quick visual example. After the Arizona Cardinals upgraded their weight room, and I'll go ahead here and share a couple photos with you watching online on our YouTube channel. They spent about $15 million to renovate the current center. This is why it's $100 million new center. So post renovation, you can see here's what the weight room looks like. You can see that this is actually, we may not be able to tell, you may think there's more weight room behind it, right? The answer is no, this is essentially the size of the weight and training room. It's a bit smaller than most of the other weight rooms that you will see. Whereas compared to looking at the New England Patriots with like their weight and training room, you're looking at something that's quite larger in scale and size. This is just the one part for the racks that's being lifted. They did some upgrades
Fit
at
in
least
the
to that spot.
picture.
The nice thing you can't even fit in. The Cardinals, you can see at least that it is just a little bit smaller, one length for the most part. Just have a lot of things are kind of compressed together. Ultimately, this is where I think getting a lot of things fixed in this new renovation is going to be helpful. It just is one of those things, Marcos, like you said, fans would prefer to be able to see the team make these investments before the grades come out versus seeing it after the grades go down. Let's go ahead here and be able to at least, and I always say, look on the bright side of that there are improvements coming. The team is at least moving. And I think it's a good sign that the Cardinals, despite everything that you can say ranking 32nd, they do seem to have something with Jonathan Gannon. He was the 8th highest ranked coach in the entire players poll. It's been something where we've talked about, at least he's so far, has been on a very good trek as far as with the players being able to run through a wall for him. We've seen the Cardinals double their win total from their first year under Gannon. Now the question is just going to be, can they be able to turn this around to become, at the end of the day, a winning franchise? Let's go now and shift into talking a little bit of the combine. So with the NFL combine every year, Marcos, it always feels like there is pros and there's cons to people looking at it. Some people are going to put way too much into the combine, and there's going to be some who are actually going to be like, oh, that guy ran that amount of speed. It's all right, at least. He plays faster in game field. What I think we end up learning in a lot of different cases is that what the combine does in a lot of places is that it matters for one specific thing to most teams, and it is the medical testing and medical history. So with medical checks, medical rechecks, a guy who shows up who had a knee injury, he goes there. Teams are able to have their team doctor take a look at the knees, see the progress, being able to see how it's looking. But the drills are honestly one of the most fun things that we can be able to watch. You're able to watch, guys running the 40-yard dash is something that you'll be able to take a look at. Being able to see guys jump up at least with like a 40 inches worth of height is something else that we can talk about. What we're also seeing that's interesting is less and less players who are actually playing, or I should say participating in the NFL Combine year in and year out, which is interesting to say the least. Back at least long time ago, you would be able to say that guys who would be lining up and running the 40-yard dash and guy wouldn't show up, you'd question his speed. You'd say, hey, this isn't what you'd want to do. Nowadays, guys prefer to control their own narrative instead and be able to actually say, I'm not going to participate at the combine. I'm not going to throw at the combine. Quarterbacks have become infamous for this. Shadur Sanders and Cam Ward, the top 2 quarterbacks, neither of them are participating in the drills. There's some other defensive linemen who are not participating. There's also been some interesting news, but I'm curious, when you look at some of the way that the combine is kind of turned from being just a recheck and putting some of these guys through some tests on the exact same track, the exact same field. Like, it's not like it's a fast track where a guy who's maybe a 4.44 type of a guy in his 40-yard dash, he's able to hit a low 4.4 or a 4.39 on the fast track. Guys are all in the same place, the same track overall. They're all in the same conditions, the same stress. It's something that I know a lot of scouts, at least in the past, have talked about as being something that really helps a lot of these competitors be able to show up, want to be able to compete. And what we're starting to see kind of is less and less guys who are showing up, especially the big stars, who are actually participating. I'm kind of curious, do you think if the combine at some point of what we're seeing is starting to kind of fade away?
Oh boy, look at that. The next Isaiah Simmons right there,
No,
defensive back running
Nick
4.38. But
Emanuwari outrunning Derwin James on the TV on the
yeah,
screen there.
so
Big
there
guy.
uh, the thing about the combine is, and especially now that like a lot of players are taking their own like future into control, is because they have their pro days, which were with their pro days, they can control and dictate what kind of, what kind of not exercises, but what kind of drills they want to run and showcase out there. It is a showcase fest for sure. When it comes to the combine, you don't dictate and you don't control any of that. And yes, there are certain circumstances where a player will refuse to do one certain drill. Like there's players that have ran like in the low like 4.3s or the high, somewhere in the 4.4s. They refuse to do the bench press. And you have the same issue with somebody who will do the opposite way. They'll do the bench press because they're really, really, really strong and whatnot, but they'll refuse to do every other drill. So you do kind of question when they don't want to participate in a certain drill, what's going on.
Mhm.
DK Metcalf, as a matter of fact, he's a good example.
Mm.
Do you remember back in 2019 when DK Metcalf was touted as this crazy freak athlete that like could go from the first round all the way up to the third? You had no idea what you were going to get with him. Well, one of the things that dragged his stock down was the fact that he didn't want to do the 3-cone. Why didn't he want to do the 3-cone? He's a top heavy person. His weight, his mass is a little higher. Like, so he has a high center of gravity because of how strong he is, how tall he is. He ran 4.36, I believe, or 4.34 or 4.33 in the 40-yard dash, which people were saying that's blazing speed.
Yeah.
But why didn't he run the 3-cone? So that means he's a bad wide receiver. Well, the introduction that I had to him was Brett Coleman, Monster Mississippi video. It's a really good video. I recommend it. He went over how you have to, as a head coach, not only draft somebody that you can, pick up on their strengths, but maximize those strengths as much as possible. Look
Absolutely.
at him a couple of years later. Not only has he improved when it comes to his short, like planting his foot and making turns on a dime, but he's had a really good career, and I was really pushing for the Cardinals to draft him. Of course, they didn't, but he's a good example. His stock dropped because of his 3-cone. He didn't participate in it. No, actually, he did participate in it. I'm sorry.
I've got the mock draftable chart. For those who wonder, mock draftable, I've never been to mockdraftable.com. The idea behind it is pretty easy. What it does is it takes every sort of verifiable grade that you can have and puts it all together into one spot and then puts that onto what's called a spider graph. So it kind of looks like a pizza, and you look at different slices. Some slices are going to be higher than others. So a good example is, let's say that you're DK Metcalf and you got a score of 98. That means out of 100% of everyone who's ever lifted in the bench press, it means that he's better than 98% of them. 100th percentile means you're the top. Meanwhile, first percentile means that you are the lowest, or that there is no one who actually has a lower physical measurement than you in that place. So when it came to someone like DK Metcalf, he at that size ran in the 4.3s, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, like, this is a guy who could end up going like top 10. This is like a guy who could be like a franchise-changing wide receiver. And then, like you said, a lot was made out of that 3-cone drill, where he just did not change direction very well. So there was a lot of questions. He ended up finishing a very, very poor 20-yard shuttle to run back and forth, and very, very poor 3-cone drill. There's not a lot of success rates for guys who at least did not have that change of direction. We've talked about Isaiah Simmons back and forth. 4.3 speed, huge size, great playmaking ability, did not have the ability to shift and turn his hips. Now, even with some of that, right, he didn't run the 3-cone at all, and that was part of that 2020 draft for the most part. You see, when DK did run it, he got hit for it, I should say, in his draft stock. But there was something else that was there as well with DK Metcalf, and it was at the combine, they checked his neck, and a lot of teams were actually worried that his neck injury, that there was like either a fusion or something that went on there. So a lot of teams, even though they saw the size and the speed, part of the reason why he fell so low was because teams went, hey, I know that DK Metcalf is a freak compared to Andy Isabella, but if Andy Isabella can play for 6 or 7 years and DK can only play for less than 1, that's something that we can't do. And that came up with one of the players that the Cardinals drafted in, I believe it was the 2013 NFL draft, which was Ryan Swope. This is a niche, really hard. You gotta like dig if you're gonna remember Ryan Swope. But this is the guy who was taken in the 6th round of the 2013 NFL draft. People like one of Johnny Manziel's favorite targets, great slot receiver. He had so many concussions to that point that he had not gotten cleared to really play football yet. So he fell to that level. Cardinals took a chance on him in the 6th round. He ended up never playing actually a down of real NFL football. So that's when it comes down to the medicals being something that is super important. Often the drills, the flash, the pizzazz, some of those things are awesome and worth entertainment value. But to teams, being able to know this is a guy who I drafted, I'm paying this amount of money to him, and he's not going to play a down of football for me because he's retired, because we did not utilize properly the medical check. That's one of the things that really showcases itself at the combine, with teams come and guys get those checks. And then we'll go at their pro days a lot of times to be able to be in their comfortable own environment, be able to have things more scripted. Some of the guys can choose to stand on the combine scores rather than have to run again. So we've seen a lot of players who will cut their weight to run fast at the combine and then gain weight as quick as they can, say, I can run a 4.57. I can run a 4.57. But check out my weight now. My weight is actually a little bit heftier, a little bit bigger, and I can, push a little bit more. those are all things that are up to the players to kind of control their portion of it. And that's kind of the stories that we talk about. So, with that being said, Marco, some of the stories that we have going on at the NFL Combine are very unique, especially at the top of the draft. So, we're going to take a look here at the NFL's Tankathon 2025 mock draft. We're going to be next week looking at doing another one of these with post combine news. But some of the top guys in Cameron Ward, Abdul Carter, are not actually participating at the combine. Shadur Sanders is also not throwing. Mason Graham, who is the Michigan lineman, we've seen, I believe, him or in other cases, the other Michigan lineman. I believe his name is Kenneth. I'll have to remember exactly the full name here, but there have been some interesting medical issues. So Abdul Carter was essentially cleared to resume training. He had a shoulder injury. Then the medical recheck showed that there was at least a little bit of a setback. So that showed that he's not going to work out. He ended up going home, kind of casting doubt into whether or not he's going to end up being one of those guys who could go at the number 1 or number 2 overall selection. That's one of the pieces of news. I think Kenneth Grant is the name that just came to my mind here. The other thing, at least, you'll have is players talking a little bit about some of their season. So one of the players that's been mocked to the Arizona Cardinals is Michael Williams. We've seen him as an edge rusher. He said that he was dealing with an ankle injury he aggravated in the Super Bowl and played at only 60% this season. So that's something that's really interesting where it's like, hey, I'm not going to be here. I'll work on my pro day, but I only played at 60%. Well, that can take his season and put it into a whole new context. When you look at that, he still looked like he was being able to wreck quite a few games, but his sack numbers were down from what people expected. Michael Williams, at least as an edge rusher, only had 5 sacks on this year, and people thought this was going to be like a big step forward year for him. There's a couple of other things as far as when it came to some of the other guys, whether it's with the medicals or some of the news. But at the end of the day, Marcos, a lot of what we're starting to see here is going to be teams building for the free agency period that pops up over. And then within the next 2 weeks, teams will start working out trades. They'll offer up some different players. And there's been some interesting drama that's gone on with a couple of teams, particularly ones within the NFC West. Before we talk at least a bit about some of that with guys looking at pursuing trades, some of those areas there with injuries, what's something you remember about for kind of those who maybe haven't been, something in the combine in the past that you thought highly of, or something that maybe you mistook? I think there's a lot of people who at least can look at the entertainment value of the combine. And then when a guy goes in the 5th round, we're like, what happened? That guy ran so fast at the combine. And it's because, well, there's something else that came out either behind the scenes, whether it was with the off field, we talk about off field issues, or whether it came out with some of the other injury stuff where it's like, hey, there may be things that are dropping him down some of these draft boards that we may not know about, but NFL teams are starting to dial into at the combine.
Now, I think you're going to have to correct me on this if I'm wrong, but the one that stands out to me was just a few years ago with so what was the top defensive tackle of the 2023 class. He was either touted to, I'm not touted, that he was either going to be drafted by the Cardinals when he was on board, but he played for Georgia. There was an incident that happened where somebody got into an accident.
Jalen Carter was one of those guys I think we're talking about with Jalen Carter. Had the car issue. He had a horrible pro day as far as being out of shape and out of condition. Yeah.
Exactly. So that one is the one that comes to my mind when it comes to that context. I'm not sure if he participated in the combine, but I do know that when he participated in his pro day, he was doing drills. He was just completely out of it. And people were talking about how that tanked his stock. Obviously, now you're seeing him 2 years later, like not only dominate, he's always available, and he's one of the premier pass rushers. There was a lot of context with that and behind the scenes. Of course, the incident really put into perspective of like the character that he had. So maybe he wasn't draftable by every team. And of course, if he's drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, where, you know, it's basically Georgia's all their defense anyway. He's playing alongside teammates that he's played before. So maybe that comes into context. But I think about that when it comes to like, does this player succeed with every team that's going to, or is he going to be a specific player, regardless of how he does? Like, let's just say he runs like a slow 40. Let's say it's like an Anquan Bolden or Larry Fitzgerald. They ran slow 40s, but then they dominate. and people were, maybe might look at that and think to themselves, yeah, that's not that's not crazy speed. Well, it's been said that like Larry Fitzgerald has actually a faster 40 than what he put out there, and it's not like Anquan Bolden hasn't like burned any DBs when it comes to speed. He did it when he played his first game ever against the Lions, where he caught a ball within the flat, like 5 yards and 10 yards, took it to the house, and it's like, whoa, where did that come from? He ran 4.62 in the combine. Well, it's because sometimes even with the combine, with the numbers and the measurables they put out, game film is different. It was definitely true about Tyrann Mathieu, and it's true about all sorts of players. They're just faster in the game, and they're just good football players.
Yep. Good to remember at least that James Conner, who's considered like, probably at this point one of the top running backs in the National Football League, with his combine performance, he only ran a 4.640. So you're talking about, okay, well, and he doesn't have that. Does he have the breakaway speed that someone has? And the answer, at least, is that some guys, for the most part, they may not have that, what you're talking about, combine of that track speed that a lot of guys have. Sometimes you see guys who can fly and they have that track speed. Like, easy example you think of is a guy like a John Brown who would get open deep, a Devonta Smith with the Eagles. There's some of those guys who end up being able to make the best use of it, or a DK Metcalf who we've talked about, who may or may not be on the Seattle Seahawks next year. That's going to be one of the interesting cases to look at. But one of the things when it comes to ultimately the game of football is that you can take a look at some of the guys and how they've played, and then some of the guys at the combine, and can say that really at the end of the day, we don't know. Like, we can make our guesses, we can make our errors, we can take a look. One of the biggest stories that we've had so far in the NFL combine has been, I believe that his name is Shamar Stewart, and he is a pass rusher for the Texas A&M Aggies. He has been shattering a lot of the kind of combine record stuff for defensive linemen when it comes to the athleticism. Just kind of pulling up one of these examples here. I believe it's going to be Mar Stewart. So he last year had 1.5 sacks. Year before, 1.5 sacks. And before that, 1.5 sacks. So what does he do at the combine? Well, at the combine, he goes out there and kills it with his workout. He comes in at about 6'5", 267, and then he runs a 4.6 40-yard dash. You're like, oh, this guy weighs 27 pounds heavier than like James Conner, maybe even 30 pounds heavier on a good day. And he runs just as fast as him. He also had an explosive vertical and a broad jump. Just shows himself as a phenomenal athlete. Now, what's interesting with that is you say, wow, the athleticism is fantastic. How in the world do you only have 1.5 sacks in college? And I think that shows that there's other areas to the game, whether it's the mental side of the game, whether it's looking back at the tape. And a lot of people said, hey, he's a guy who's a game wrecker on tape, but he doesn't have the same sort of football discipline of getting the technique, getting some of those things right. Some coaches will look at that and say, yeah, this is a guy, you take that raw talent, athleticism, you can coach it up, be able to turn him into a guy who can be a game wrecker. Others will take a look at that and say, when you look back over at the tape, you can say, hey, it's all the athleticism in the world, but he's not going to be able to be someone you can rely on when teams are going to try on putting up a different blocking play on him for the most part, where he mentally misses something because he's just not able to get there into the backfield, or explodes in a straight line to the quarterback, gets there quickly. Quarterback is able to quickly move, and he just is a step late. These are all things not to take one way or the other, but just to be able to recognize, Marcos, that we need to look at these things and enjoy it, but also have loose hands when it comes to some of these things, when it comes to the NFL Combine. Because at the end of the day, I do think that we put a lot of emphasis onto what did a guy do in college without realizing that in the NFL, it's a totally different animal. While at the same time, you take a look at a guy who was a Dennis Gardeck, an undrafted free agent, not the most athletic guy in the world, and he went out there and has been able to consistently perform at a good enough level where he would lead the Cardinals in sacks, it seemed like, for a stretch of the season every couple of years. These are all things that I think when it comes to the combine, it gets fun because you get to kind of fall in love with these players' stories, see some of the areas of potential. We can even look back in years ago and be like, yeah, you guys remember like when Isaiah Simmons blew up the combine, where is he now? Or, hey, look at the Cardinals. They wanted Shane Ray in the 2000 and I think it was 2014 NFL draft. And when you take a look at who they got instead, well, they got one guy named Marcus Golden instead. And Marcus Golden, let me tell you, he is not the most athletic guy. He has big hands, but you take a look at some of these athleticisms compared to other defensive ends, even just other outside linebackers. He's bigger, he had big hands, but that emphasis, that effort, the good technique, he was a guy who was able to have pretty much a 9-10 year career in the league. And I think that just shows part of why people love football so much, Marcos, is it doesn't mean that A plus B is always going to equal C, but it does mean that athleticism plus the hard work does give you the opportunity to be able to deliver. And situation and fit is also important as well. Cardinals were probably going to make a bad choice in the NFL draft. The draft fell into a special way, and they're able to walk away with DJ Humphries, Marcus Golden, and David Johnson, one of the most successful drafts, if not the most successful draft that Steve Keim has ever had. And it wasn't even what they wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly. I believe it was Abdullah or that they wanted
Amir
to draft
Abdullah.
ahead.
Yeah.
And then it ended up to be like he got picked by, I think it was the Lions. So they were like, oh, plan B is David Johnson. I actually saw his highlights before the Cardinals drafted him. So I was very excited because I looked at the 6'1" frame, the 225-pound, 235-pound, like a running back that has that jump cut ability, watching him run away from DBs in college. So I was like excited about that. One person that had a really good combine was Trey McBride. Trey McBride blew it up in the combine for tight ends. He had a really solid one. He ran 4.57 or 4.52 in the 40. Had a the drills, mostly, not so much the other like exercising or whatnot, but the drills where he had really good hands. He showed that he can catch the ball really well. He showed that he has good movement, and he had a good, ball tracking ability and whatnot. But I remember watching his a recap from a YouTuber where he basically was pointing out how good of a blocker he was when he pushed the sled back. He was like, "That's very impressive for somebody who's only 255 pounds."
Yeah.
So this guy is somebody to get excited about. I got excited. So thankfully we drafted him, and just like you said, he was somewhat booed as a Cardinals draft pick, but no one's booing him now.
Yeah, exactly. Like a little bit more context for some places also too that will help as far as, because we'll go over some of these mock draftable charts when it comes up with some of the players and talk about even some of the Cardinals targets. So we talked about DK Metcalf already. You can see at least this is a guy who did not have a great lateral change of direction. We've talked about the 98th percentile being good. That's about out of 100%. 98th out of 100% is great. What about if a player is at 0th or at first percentile? Like there's no one who's had it less than they have. And the answer is that the Cardinals actually have one of these players, and they actually drafted him first overall out of Oklahoma. Kyler Murray has the shortest arms of any quarterback that has ever measured in at the combine. He was 0th percentile when it came to his overall wingspan. Now, what's funny is you take a look at some of the other quarterbacks who he compares to as far as having a shorter arm length and wingspan. Some of the guys like a Bryce Young, a Brock Purdy, and then even I think it was a guy in Baker Mayfield who also went with the first overall pick. We realized that, hey, when it comes to being an NFL quarterback, if you're not 6'5" or super tall, super freaky athletic, like the example that most people think of is Josh Allen, but the real one is going to be a Cam Newton, as far as, or maybe even an Andrew Luck. The biggest difference between these kind of hyper athletes may end up not being as much as we think. So there's Kyler Murray. You take a look at now Cam Newton, maybe one of the most athletic quarterbacks we've ever seen. You want to know who actually was more athletic than Cam Newton? The guy named Anthony Richardson. And Anthony Richardson, we found out from the combine, he is not really guaranteed a starting job this year. He is more athletic, harder, more explosive, but he's had issues more with accuracy. There's been injury issues he's had. It just goes to show that whenever we talk about the combine and this athletic freak or these things, that while it's great to put those things into a context, we always got to make sure we take a step back and say, okay, Kyler Murray is not as athletic as Anthony Richardson, but Kyler Murray, I know, is going to walk out there as the week 1 starter for the Arizona Cardinals. Anthony Richardson's got a camp battle he's going to have to play. That's why I think it's great to remember that while there's a lot of things you can put together and say that this is going to be what determines a successful athlete, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that are out there that A lot of things out there that people will try to sell you. Well, I've got beach property in Arizona to sell you. At the end of the day, there's times we can say, hey, look, I nailed that pick. I nailed that player. I knew that they had the athleticism. Other times, we don't know. Kyle Pitts was a guy I think people remember back in that 2000, Dan, I want to say 2020, was it 2022, 2021 NFL draft? I want it's 2021 NFL draft. And he was a physical freak. Like, as far as it comes to with being able to have a huge explosive broad jump, he ran faster than almost any other. He essentially was a large wide receiver playing at the tight end position, had the production in college. In the NFL, he hasn't done much. In the NFL, you take a look at a Trey McBride, who is not nearly as athletic, who isn't nearly as quick, and who does have good sized hands for making those catches, and he's been a much stronger and better player. So these are kind of the things you have to look in, which is you got to look at not just looking at the overall of just saying this narrative fits, this narrative is here, but being able to take a look sometimes at the individual player and looking at some of the tape. And then there's other times that you can just kind of chalk it up and say in black and white. The best example of these is you want to take a look at the heights of Trey McBride. So he's about 6'3", 246 pounds or so. So it's a little bit smaller than a lot of other tight ends, especially blockers. Take a look at a Rob Gronkowski. When he came out in the second round, he didn't have a whole lot of production, but at 260 pounds with some of the longest arms, the biggest hands, a really fast 40-yard dash, pretty good overall round. He was just big with really big and good hands and could catch. He's gone on to become maybe the best tight end that we've ever seen in the game. Some guys back in the past may talk about, some other ones who've excelled, such as a Tony Gonzalez, or even looking at there was a guy who played for years with Phillip Rivers, I know as well. But at the end of the day, you're like, yeah, you know what? Sometimes, Marcos, when it comes to football, big man, go fast and catch ball is actually a suitable way to scout. And that's why it's fun, I think, to take all of these things, put them together, and then kind of set your ward, be able to learn and then grow from where you may have missed the year before, and be able to develop as you're looking through with your team. And the people who are going to be at the head of all of that is the Arizona Cardinals with their general manager, Monty Ossenfort. So now Ossenfort did speak to the Arizona Cardinals and also the rest of the NFL media. The Combine, Jonathan Gannon also spoke to them as well. There was some really interesting, I would say at least, kind of takeaways that we were able to see. A lot of things that they said at least were pretty much more settled, like as far as it comes to with the running back position. Doesn't seem like the Cardinals are intent on drafting one high. We'll talk about a big name that Cardinals fans have talked about here to kind of close out our show. But they have talked about being able to be wise and effective with some of the cap space that they have. They've talked about some different players from Philadelphia. They haven't really kind of played their hand out too much, but what we've seen from them, they said, is they expect a great year from Kyler Murray. They expect some of their guys to take a step forward, and they're going to spend money where it does make sense. These are all things I think, Marcos, that we can be able to say is part of what Cardinal fans have been waiting for, honestly, has been this third year of what at the time seemed like maybe a 1 or a 2 year, but has kind of entered into this 3-year rebuild where the Cardinals are now set to try to go for it to officially push to make the playoffs.
Yep, and it's sad. It's a situation where we ended up, improving from our record. So you just build on it like you did in 2020 to 2021, and with all that cap space, I mean, you have to sign a big name. You have to sign like not just one, but a couple of big names. I'm not so sure about throwing the bank at one player and whatnot. And those two players from the Philadelphia Eagles, those definitely are upgrades in our positions, because we can't go this year with the edge group that we had last year. We absolutely have to be able to add on to that. Even if you have one of your players who was injured all year, even if you have him coming back for us, I forgot what is.
BJ Ojulari, I believe, is that edge rusher. Mm-hmm.
If you have that guy coming back, and Ojulari, like his brother Aziz, look like they could be, the type of players that, on a good season, they can give you 10 sacks. We can't just bank on that. So this year, it has to be that we spend and then supplement in the draft, try to get ourselves those supplemental players that could come in and either sit back and develop, or, I mean, obviously, if you're drafting in the first, second round, you're expecting them to be starters, but make sure you nail the draft when it comes to getting the names. So I thought Cooper DeJean should have been a Cardinal last year.
Hmm.
Obviously, we didn't go that route because he decided to trade back, and we got Max Melton. Max Melton's still young. He definitely is he's an athlete himself as well, and he has a great upside. But as somebody that just got drafted and started with Cooper DeJean, I understand that he's a slot cornerback, and we already have one in Garrett Williams, but you want to make sure that you get those players when you can, and not just like trade back and then hope to God that those guys are still available at that position. So this year, like, let's spend. We got to spend.
Yeah, no, I agree. One thing that will help the Arizona Cardinals with their spending is going to be the salary cap. So the salary cap for this year, it's always through collectively bargain within the players, the league. Everyone kind of determines it. The league set the cap at 279.2 million per team for the whole season. Now, last year it was 255 million. So you're talking about an increase that's essentially, I think, unless I'm mistaken, that would be about 25 or so. So that'd be 200 and sorry, this is me doing my math on the fly. Yeah, it'd be about an additional $25 million up from last year. So what that means, at least, is the Cardinals have a fantastic opportunity because that means that their effective cap room when it goes up. Let me pull the I just had the over the cap stuff over here. Apologies, folks. At least I had the information right here. Cap. There we go. So the Cardinals now, in terms of cap space, has gone up. So the active cap space that they're going to have that they can use that they're spending is at about $74 million. They're spending right now about $204 million. Now, a lot of NFL teams, when it comes to cap space, the way that I always like to think about this is you're playing Monopoly, and let's say that you are putting in actual money into Monopoly. So you got me, Marcos, and let's say my dog are playing Monopoly. Now, my dog does not have nearly enough money to be able to put into play. But what we all do is we agree and say, hey, we're going to split the money into 3 different parties. That's how much we can spend. And if we're going to be seeing that that's where we're generating our income and revenue from, essentially how that'll all play out is that just because you have cap space, it's kind of the league is saying, yes, there's cash that you have, and there also is a cap floor, meaning you have to spend it. So what that doesn't mean is that the Cardinals now all of a sudden have $204 million. They're going to go out there and throw 50 million, and then sign a bunch of players. They have to keep money to sign their rookies. They have to manage the cap of players that they've already signed, such as new extensions for Budda Baker, new extension for James Conner. They at least are in the opportunity, though, of being able to build up their cap space by letting stuff roll over for the last few years. So if you remember in 2023, they had to cut DeAndre Hopkins to get off of essentially his contract for 2024. That meant that they had a lot of what's called dead money or money that's already been allocated. This is something where over the last couple of years, because Michael Bidwell went and paid a lot of the guys what they needed to, Steve Keim would kind of kick the can down the road. So a good example is AJ Green signs a 2-year deal for about $12 million a year, but we're only going to pay him $3 million this year. We're going to then have $4 million in dead money down the road, and then another $4 million in dead money that kind of keeps carrying over. So this is something that the Cardinals, when they were pushing and trying to go for it, they had a lot of these contracts. And then when Kyler Murray did sign his deal, that also put a lot of emphasis on, hey, all of these veteran players, all these guys they've traded for and signed in free agency, at some point you kind of have to have the rent come due, because otherwise you will turn into the teams that are at the bottom of this list, such as the New Orleans Saints, who right now they've accounted for about, I would say, 281 million or so of their actual active cap spending. They also are going to have about $50 million or so that they're going to have to spend this year for the floor. So what that means is they're $50 million in the hole. They got to cut $50 million from their team and their roster before they can even hit to where they're at for the most part. And the reason why is it's all revenue sharing. Like, there's part of how the league works. And the Cardinals were in one of these spots, at least for the most part, in terms of dead money. So they were never as high as 50 million in dead money or 48 in dead million, 48 million in dead money. But Marcos, they've at least been able to work their way out of it. And now they're at a spot where they actually have some flexible cap room. The only teams that have more money to spend than them are the New England Patriots, the Oakland Raiders, or I should say Las Vegas Raiders, the Washington Commanders, and the Chicago Bears. Know what those teams all have in common, Marcos, that are ahead of the Cardinals? They all have rookie quarterbacks who are on rookie contracts who were taken just last year. Even the Vikings previously were in one of those spaces before. So Raiders, of course, don't have any probably starting quarterback right now unless Tom Brady is going to walk off of the street. And they've got quite a bit of dead money that they've been left over with. This is, like you said, the opportunity to spend, and there are some very good free agents out there on the defensive side that we want to talk about now. Let's go ahead and kind of start with the biggest name to most Cardinals fans on this list, which is going to be, could there be a reunion with Hassan Reddick in the cards for, well, the Cards?
I would hope so, especially since he played with Jonathan Gannon back in Philadelphia. He has that connection with the Cardinals, but the connection with the Cardinals didn't really end well because they didn't believe that he was going to be able to continuously, continue to replicate that. So, unfortunately, they went ahead and let him test the market. He signed a 1-year contract with the with the Panthers.
Mm-hmm.
And then the very next year, of course, he got his big contract because he was able to get double-digit sacks with with the Panthers, and then signed that contract with the Eagles. Obviously, he got shipped off to the Jets, and then he had that drama happening and whatnot, and he missed like half a year of football. So he is the one that I would probably say maybe is a good fit, as in, like, you don't want to break the bank for the guy because he hasn't played. He missed a half a year of football, but you do want to make sure that you're able to pay him for at least a 1 or 2 year contract, or 2 years. So I would say he's probably one of the guys that's top of my list.
Yeah, it's something at least where when you're taking a look at how the cap worked for the Cardinals last year, and this is something at least that we can say when it comes to um, cap allocations, cap space, at least for how the table broke down from last year. They really had spent about 257 as far as the cap, and they had still rolled over about 12 million in terms of space. When you look back at how 2023 they entered, you can kind of say, okay, so there's a bit of space that's here. But when it comes to the dead cap, you see when the Cardinals, after Cliff Kingsbury and Steve Keim got those extensions, Kyler got that extension, they had $70 million in dead cap. That means that there's players who are no longer on the team, either retired or gone, that the team had to deal with. So in order to be able to actually spend some of this with the cap space, even though they had a high amount of cap space for that year, they weren't able to spend a lot of it because they had to kind of get out and kind of stagger it over the course of a couple seasons. And we see that Monty Austinfort coming in with a long-term approach, he is able to do that. They had $32 million, which is good for 23rd in the NFL in dead cap in 2024. They also were able to have quite a bit of cap allocations that were up there. They had a little bit more cap space, but you can also see reserve list is going to be money you're paid to guys who are like reserves, who are injured reserve, who are retired, all of those that are there. Entering into 2025, Cardinals cap allocations went from being, this is crazy, top 10 to 26. That means the amount of money that they're paying that Keim kicked down the road, it's not there anymore. They now don't have anyone on reserve list that they're paying. They're top 5 in terms of overall cap space at about $75 million. And in terms of dead cap money, they're down here. So this is a good thing we can talk about is the New Orleans Saints have not righted the ship. They've kind of just continued to kick the can down the road every couple of years. Same with a team like the Atlanta Falcons, who's going to be probably starting a rookie quarterback and still paying Kirk Cousins for that deal. Cardinals are in a good space. You take a look at some of their top players this year. They're paying Jonah Williams, Jalen Thompson. They've kicked a bit of Budda Baker's new contract money over into next year. And after that, it's going to be just draft picks. So we talked last time about how Trey McBride probably is going to get paid, take up quite a bit, and be one of the highest paid tight ends in the NFL. But the team is going to probably, I would estimate, spend somewhere between probably about, I would say out of the 75 million, somewhere between maybe 50 to 60 million of that, since this is more of a we can go for it year, we can sign some of these guys. This is the year where it's going to be expectation of playoffs. Now, we've talked about Hassan Reddick as being one of those guys. His overall market value, according to Spot Track, is probably about $11.7 million. He's at age 30. He's looking for a bigger deal, but with, like you said, not playing last year, he may end up with a 2-year deal with a team, but it's very likely he may end up being on a 1-year, $10 million or so sort of deal. Him returning to the Cardinals would be really interesting because he's kind of fit into that spot of being one of those mercenary pass rushers, bounces to different teams, taking who's going to be paying him. And it'd be interesting if he come back to Jonathan Gannon, given that his best season was under Jonathan Gannon's defense, getting 22 sacks as part of that great evil Super Bowl team. I think that this is something, Marcos, where when you're talking about how are you going to build a team together, you could say, would you rather pay a Hassan Reddick this amount of money at 30 years old for the amount? Do you give him a little bit longer term sort of a deal? Or you take a look at one of the other guys in the market, in a Josh Sweat that people have talked about, who previously he had a 1-year, $10 million deal. And you're probably going to be looking at least at him being 3 to 4 years younger. He's a free agent. And when it comes to what his market share and market value is likely to be, you're probably talking about $18 to $19 million a year. Right there, 18.8 million is the calculated market value, which is when you're a top pass rusher, you have the production, you're 27 years old, you're going to be looking at about 18.8 million a year. It's not going to be the highest end, but when you're talking about like the Cardinals signing Chandler Jones to that contract a while ago, Chandler Jones was on a 3-year, $51 million deal that was $17 million a year. So you're saying, okay, you go from Chandler Jones, the all-time Cardinals leading pass rusher, to Josh Sweat at $18.8 million a year. Why is that number high? And the answer is, well, when the salary cap goes up, then people are going to say, hey, no, you're not paying me based off of this player. That was in 2017 money you're playing Chandler Jones. This is 2024 money. So you can see that Josh Sweat's market value is going to go up. This is a spot where I think a lot of times people can say, oh, you're paying this guy $20 million a year for what? I think, Marcos, it's less about that and more realizing the price is going to be the price. The market is going to kind of talk, and the larger amount of cap room you have, the more guys are going to get paid. This is something that comes into context a lot when it comes to talking about some of the NFL teams and how much the different quarterbacks are making each year. Any thoughts at least you had as far as with just some of the stuff with cap room? I know a lot of fans, this can maybe be the most boring part of free agency, is like how much cap space, what are they going to have, how much are they going to actually spend, how much are you going to be spent and allocated for rookies. There's a lot that comes up in there. But at the end of the day, let's go ahead and have one big prediction of a free agent that you think the Cardinals are going to be able to sign.
All right, so my dream scenario would be to get Sweat. I don't know if that's going to be a possibility with Josh Sweat because he's going to obviously get the bag when it comes to his production wasn't like high up there, but he has high upside. My prediction is going to be that they're probably going to try to go for a team-friendly deal with Hassan Reddick, and maybe he could ride it out with us into retirement and whatnot, the same place that he started at, but that's going to be my prediction.
Yeah, that one seems to make some sense. It would be maybe a 1-year deal, bring in the mercenary. I could also see them being able to allocate some money toward the defensive line as well. I know we got a comment here from Robert Moore, talked about Milton Williams, the interior defensive lineman who's been able to rush the passer. He's probably looking at about $18 to $20 million a year as well. Marcos, I know you got to get going, at least as far as the time frame. We'll be around here for about 5 more minutes with the podcast. Want to make sure I let you go with enough time, sir.
All right, guys. It was a pleasure to be here. We will see you soon.
All right, thanks, Marcos. Yeah, all right, so let's close out here with that and then a little bit of the just other combine news. As far as for who the Cardinals could go after when we're talking about some of these top players and what they're expected to be able to make, some of these guys are going to probably not hit free agency. So Byron Murphy is likely to return to his team. You talk about Levante David at 35 years old. He's not going to be leaving that team. Free agency ends up being a lot of times where it's the guys who were not good enough to get those long-term extensions, but are good enough to be able to cash in and get a big payday. So the Eagles are a fantastic example because if you take a look at the Philadelphia Eagles and their roster, Eagles are not going to be able to pay everybody. They at least won the Super Bowl this year. They signed Saquon Barkley to a decent deal, but you take a look at, let me pull up the actual depth chart. Sorry for those of you watching online here. They have a good number of defensive linemen. So we're talking about, you have Jalen Carter as a draft pick who's starting. You have Jordan Davis, who's being able to start there. You have quite a few guys, at least, who are able to be in line to get paid, but they're also paying AJ Brown. They're paying money out for the likes of Jalen Hurts. So some of these guys are going to walk. Zach Bond, they signed him as just an undrafted free agent. He can go and get paid. Josh Sweat was their right outside linebacker. They went and drafted Nolan Smith. Guess what? They've got Jalix Hunt right behind him, ready to step in. These are all areas of when you talk about building sustainable success. This is where you're able to say, hey, we're going to invest in the draft when it's cheap, knowing we're paying our quarterback, our receivers, and a lot of offensive linemen. They can't keep each of these guys because the cap will limit it. So some of these guys, like Milton Williams, who started for them, Josh Sweat, who started for them, are going to hit free agency and walk. So I think what the Cardinals' strategy should be is to essentially say, we can take that step forward, signing some of these free agents again to be able to get to that spot. But it's ultimately going to be about the NFL draft. You're going to want to be able to say that, yes, we can sign a Jonah Williams to be a right tackle for us, but we need to be able to have someone like a Paris Johnson who we can draft, be able to be that guy who steps up and is on a cheap deal. Like Paris is making $7 million a year. Jonah is making at least 4 times that over the last 2 years in terms of his deal. As far as the cap hits, Kyler Murray's got a $45 million cap hit this season. He's got the largest cap hit on the team. But other than that, it's manageable enough that I think the Cardinals could probably hunt out a few other guys who are on that free agency list. So let's do one more look at the list before we kind of log out for today, going over the top free agents. We right now are going to switch that to the different tab on my computer here. Sorry for the wait. It's 2025. All right, there we go. So we've got, like we said, Hassan Reddick is the guy who made the 1 year, $15 million deal last year. When we're talking about what are some of the needs that the Cardinals are going to address, it's going to be on the defensive line. So it's going to be up front. Some of these guys who are set to become free agents are some good edge rushers. There's some of these players that I think were going to be out there for a reason. For example, Chase Young. He's a guy, at least, who played last for the Saints, was a former number 2 overall pick. Injuries have made it where he just has not been able to really click in the league. Marcus Davenport, a guy the Saints gave up 2 first-round picks for, 28 years old. He got cut from the Saints, ended up on the Detroit Lions. He's the guy that's going to be out there. You've got someone like Jerron Reed, who's about 32 years old, who's going to be there. Even Brandon Graham, who's a free agent, he's set to retire after just finishing up that Super Bowl win with the Eagles. So when you take a look at this list, you got to remember that it's not going to always be like this. There's going to be guys who are going to be released from their team, like a DeAndre Hopkins was cut from the Cardinals a few years ago. There's going to be players who actually get signed to deals. And there's going to be some players who on occasion will get franchise tagged, which means that they could be traded from the tag to sign to a long-term deal from another team. They could still sign a long-term deal, or just stick around with their team for another year. I think when it comes down to what you're looking for the Cardinals, the answer at least is you're going to want to look at the lower end of the age spectrum and the upper end of the age spectrum. So a good example is a free agent in Calais Campbell, who's going to turn 39 next year. He's going to be a 1 year type of deal guy. He's going 1 year to 1 year at this point. Some of these other guys, at least like DeMarcus Lawrence, maybe are nearing the back end of their career. He could maybe find a new team with a deal. The Cowboys maybe would keep him if they're going to be looking at how they deal with Micah Parsons. Looking on the younger end of the spectrum, at least, you're going to be able to see some of these guys are some familiar names. You got Azeez Ojulari is a guy I think the Cardinals will definitely pursue. They did not trade a pick for him in last year's free agency deadline. They instead traded for Baron Browning, who I think they will re-sign. He's a free agent. They liked what they saw from him. As far as it goes with like a Milton Williams, a younger guy who was a 3rd-round draft pick, they're able to bring him in. With the Eagles, he could be someone whose familiarity with Jonathan Gannon's scheme would be able to be part of that rotation. That's someone who I could see being there. There's some guys who probably are not going to come back to the Cardinals. Like you see Lucky Fotu with the Jets. The Cowboys, you have to figure out a decision is coming on Osa Odighizuwa. And then when it goes up the list to some of the other guys, you can see it's littered with some successful draft picks, some who are not. Javon Kinlaw who was a draft pick of the Niners, ended up leaving, went to a different team. Whereas Roy Lopez is a free agent for the Arizona Cardinals. He's going to be a lot cheaper to be able to pay, at least, than the likes of a Javon Kinlaw, even though Kinlaw's had injury issues. There is going to be probably some of the Cardinals keeping some of their own guys here. Of those guys, which I think they'll keep or they will let walk, I think that you could see all LJ Collier, Naquan Jones, and Roy Lopez stay. They're going to get back Justin Jones. They're going to get back, I think, the other guy that they signed from the Raiders last year, Bilal Nichols. And then they're probably going to add 2 or 3 more guys, at least, to that part of the roster. So on the defensive side, the first thing we're going to look at is the Cardinals are going to keep some of their own guys. Maybe someone gets a bigger deal, but I could see them targeting one, that $20 million a year. So then that talks about maybe $20 million worth of cap space. If they really want to be kind of swinging for it, getting both of those guys would mean you've spent about 20 plus 20, $40 million in cap space. You still have $35 million left to go for your rookies and for other players. Now let's take a look at the other defensive positions. When it comes to the edge rushers, we talked a bit about Hassan Reddick. When it comes to as far as guys that we could see comfort with, we're probably not going to see Kaiser White back with the Cardinals. We could see them move Owen Papo into kind of a starting spot. We mentioned Azeez Ojulari as someone who they could target. I would not be shocked if the Cardinals ended up actually looking to bring in someone like a Solomon Thomas or one of these like highly drafted first round players who didn't quite hit with their initial draft team. A good example of that is LJ Collier went from being a really standout college player who's probably not worth a first round pick. Seahawks took him in the first round. He goes from the Seahawks to the Cardinals, ends up tearing an ACL, but had a nice bounce back season this year. Wouldn't shock me if that's the case. 2 other players to highlight here are both linebackers. You have Zach Bond, which, because he's a former Eagle and was a defensive player of the year, I believe, candidate, people are going to wonder, are you going to chase after him? And I think we've already gotten our answer with that. And if the Cardinals are going to sign Kaiser White to a 2-year deal, let him walk, I don't think it would be that they're going to then walk out and get a Zach Bond in. No. I think that the way that they're going to make their defense is invest in the front 7, invest in the rotating in the line, invest in the secondary. And then I think they'll be able to see guys like a Zach Bond be able to come just like he did for the Eagles this last year. He's 28, had bounced around the league. You take a look, and he ended up having a incredible season after 3 down years with the Saints. He ended up kind of having the Hassan Reddick 12-sack season with the Cardinals. Just shows that sometimes situation and the talent around you can sometimes be a big part of that. As far as wrapping this up, I think I mentioned Solomon Thomas, one of the other players. There could be another player, too, who gets added to the line here. I think we have to remember also that the Cardinals are going to look at other players in the linebacker spot. So let's talk about the linebacker spot with the likes of I would say at least the outside guys versus inside is going to be a difference. So let's talk about the inside linebacker here. Excuse me as I go ahead and filter to this. Thank you. Some of the advertisements showing up. All right. We have linebacker, inside linebacker. Thank you. So when it comes to some of the top guys who are there, most of these veterans, I don't think the Cardinals are going to go after. Don't think they'll go after an Eric Kendricks or a Bobby Wagner or a Levante David. I think that they could keep one of their own guys in a Chris Barnes who plays that. I don't think they'll do a Kevin White. If they really wanted to be able to try to scheme up one of these players or two, maybe you would take a look and say, hey, we can go out there and get someone like say an Eric Kendricks to go out, call the defense, get him in on a 1-year deal. Something like that is maybe, but at 33 years of age, what I think we've seen from Jonathan Gannon is they'll draft another guy. They'll have 2 linebackers in the middle. Owen Papo will probably step up, and they'll end up with being able to invest not at the linebacker spot inside, but at the other places around it. Last thing we'll talk about the defensive side is going to be in the secondary. This spot is pretty set for the Cardinals. Maybe they decide that they're going to want someone different than a Sean Murphy Bunting. But when it comes to some of the guys for top market value and some of the age, they've spent a lot of draft capital and a lot of money on their secondary. They've brought in Dadrian Taylor-Demerson. Unless the Cardinals really feel like that they're a number one corner type short of being able to have that guy to be able to compete. And as far as the top guys who are there on the market, you're probably talking about a Carlton Davis or the Niners' Charvarius Ward coming off of his time with the Chiefs. He signed a couple of years with the Niners. You're probably going to be taking a look, at least, at just saying that the Cardinals are probably going to run it back with Starling Thomas and some of the other guys who are there. I don't see anyone who seems to be that big of a fit. Maybe you could move Sean Murphy Bunting out, move someone else in at the cornerback spot, but this is the one place on the defensive side that seems pretty set for the Cardinals. And of course, like we said, at the safety spot, with the re-signing of Budda Baker, unless the Cardinals decide that they're going to go about trading one of their other safeties, most likely that would be a Jalen Thompson. It does make sense to keep a good safety on your roster, not having to put the rookie in just yet. And I don't think that they're going to chase any of these guys after either. Like a Jeremy Chin doesn't make sense. Ashton Davis has had injury issues with concussions. We've seen a Devontae Casey is someone who's been very violent, has gotten a couple of times in the playing field. It's been hit. Trevon Moehrig, a top overall pick. It seems like the Cardinals' investment, what they've done over the past few years has been invest on the line, the wide receivers at tight end, invest in the secondary, and they've invested also at running back. That means this year is going to be more of a D-line investing year. So as far as for tight predictions, I think I'll make a bold prediction, say the Cardinals will get both Josh Sweat and Milton Williams. I think if they do not get one of them, I think it would be Sweat. I have a good feeling that interior pressure, bringing back some of the guys they have, but having like that one guy who can get pressure on third down in a Milton Williams, I think that's like the splash signing that the Cardinals could go after, who also would have familiarity with their head coach, Jonathan Gannon, who's part of the team that drafted him. As far as other news around the league, just to be able to wrap up, we'll see how it goes. There's a couple more days of the combine. We're hoping to have a guest on next week to break it all down. But in the meantime, that's really been it for the most part. As far as Cardinals fans, we've got a few more days left of the combine. Last thing that I wanted to talk about tonight, of course, is going to be one specific player for Arizona. And some people have asked, is Cam Skattebo a possibility for the Arizona Cardinals? This is the reason why I wanted to close this for the show, is it's not easy to just say yes. It is not easy to just say no. So Skattebo did not end up running at all today in the 40-yard dash. He's doing the other drills, but he said today he's not going to run. People have said that he is probably a little bit slower is what the questions have had from his tape size. He's going to run at the pro day. He's a little bit smaller at 5'11" and 216 pounds. I think a lot of times you say, well, 5'11", 216, maybe it's not that much smaller. Well, compare that to a James Conner, who's probably about 6'1" and about 220, 225. Maybe he plays 5 pounds lighter. Scat's one of those guys that, because of the athleticism and a lot of these other running backs in this class, he is not going to be ranked as highly as some of the others. Now, that, give or take, is part of where you can at least say that guys in college and guys in the pros, they're going to be at different skill levels. But when it comes to the 2025 NFL draft, as far as the draft rankings, Pro Football Focus, at least, doesn't have Skattebo as very highly rated. They have Ashton Gianti is the one guy who most people seem to think is going to be a first-round running back. We have Amarian Hampton. They have his up higher. They've got Cam Skattebo as running back 3. There's some teams who are going to look at that and have him closer to like running back 13. Caleb Johnson, Iowa, is much more physically gifted. There's going to be a couple of other guys, I think, at least, who are going to actually perform well at the combine. The one that I was looking at, too, with, I think it was going to be, let me take a look here at the, so I had a list I had pulled out, just had to reload the page at least here. Yeah, Travion Henderson from Ohio State is one of the other backs who's there, who's got like blazing speed. Quishon Judkins, 6'1", 219, closer to the James Conner size. This means that Cam Skattebo is probably going to fall a bit further than Cardinals fans would like to have him go. The comparison I would like to think of is, and we were projecting into the 4th round for Eno Benjamin. He ended up falling to the 7th round. So when you're talking about that and you say, all right, Cam Scatterboo, is he going to be one of those guys that goes a bit earlier than we think? Because as we've seen, a lot of people said he probably could have been a Heisman-related player. Maybe the league is one of those question marks that he may not have the same sort of speed to be an every down player. I think that where he could go would be probably somewhere in round 4. Because when you take a look at what the value is going to be in this year, we know teams are going to go after quarterbacks. They'll always go after pass rushers. They'll go after offensive linemen. There's going to be a couple of receivers that they'll grab this year, as well as it's a pretty good tight end class. But there's enough running backs that are here for the most part that I think it is going to ultimately push him down. Whether that means the Cardinals take him in the 4th round or not is going to be interesting. Monty Ossenfort did end up saying, at least, that he really thought that the Cardinals liked their running backs. They like James Conner as a starter. They really have high hopes for Trey Benson. Does that mean that they won't take a running back? I don't think it rules it out. But if you're talking about spending a round 1, obviously no. Round 2, round 3, even pick on a running back when you've got a lot of those needs, I don't think that's something the Cardinals would do. When it comes to round 4, if you think that this is a guy that, hey, we like the player, we think that he can do a pass catching, he passes a lot of the other metrics, maybe that's when you start to see a team or two look at taking him. But ultimately, I think that at the end of the day, there's probably going to be a team that needs Cam Scatterboo more than the Arizona Cardinals. I could see him going probably somewhere in being a day 3 pick in round 5. And whether that's to the Cardinals or a different team, it's going to be kind of up to a Monty Ossenfort because, again, there's a lot of really good guys ahead of him, including a Jalen Blue, who's going to probably run somewhere in the 4.3s with his speed. But if it's up to me, I'd say, hey, give me Scat. I think that it's one of the players that they have, at least for the most part, that you sometimes will take a look at and say that he should be a little bit lower athletically than others. He's going to go a little bit later. But just like a James Conner was able to show with running a 4.6 and having good size, he's still out there running as a top solid running back, showing that as long as you've got enough burst and ability, whether it's your vision, being able to break some of the tackles, it's one of those places where I would not rule it out for Cam Scatterboo. I'll say that for sure. I just am kind of in agreement saying I don't think that you're going to bet on him as far as with the NFL draft. A lot of NFL draft teams will say. If your draft is ultimately a bet, that number 1 overall pick is the biggest bet you can make. The second biggest bet you can make is going to be on that number 2 player, and so on and so forth. So count me as one who would love to see the Cardinals draft him. It does make a little bit of sense if you're talking about James Conner on a 2-year deal. Cam Scatterboo's your running back 3. You get Trey Benson able to kind of be your starter. But I think there's other teams such as the Niners, maybe even Jim Harbaugh liking that attitude, who could probably bring him in as a second running back and see could he be a change of pace back for us somewhere between round 4 and round 5. Thank you guys so much for joining. This has been the Redbird Reboot podcast. Again, appreciate you guys coming in. We should have another show early next week breaking down the combine, as well as being able to kind of take one last look of what the big takeaway we've had for what does the draft look like, how does it stack up, and we'll have a mock draft for you guys. Thank you guys for tuning in on a Friday night, and go Cardinals. It's been the Redbird Reboot podcast. We've been rebooted. It's time for us now to log off. And me take my dog for a walk, who's been barking. Thanks, guys.